Hello, and welcome to episode 52 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Federica Russo, assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam. Federica is an Italian-born philosopher of science interested in causality and probability in the social, biomedical, and policy sciences, and in the relations between science and technology. Federica is perhaps most well known for the Russo-Williamson Thesis. With her co-author, Federica argues that the health sciences make causal claims on the basis of evidence both of physical mechanisms and of probabilistic dependencies. Consequently, an analysis of causality solely in terms of physical mechanisms or solely in terms of probabilistic relationships does not do justice to the causal claims of these sciences. Yet there seems to be a single relation of cause in these sciences, and pluralism about causality will not do either. Instead, they maintain that the health sciences requires a theory of causality that unifies its mechanistic and probabilistic aspects. They argue that the epistemic theory of causality provides the required unification. And so, for more about the Russo-Williamson Thesis, for more about Federica's origin story, her other exciting upcoming projects, and for a bit more philosophizing than usual on this typical podcast, let's bring in Federica. Dr. Federica Russo, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this afternoon?
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I'm very well this afternoon. It's nearly evening here in Europe, actually.
Where in Europe are you calling us from?
I'm calling from Brussels today, although, as you know, I'm based in Amsterdam.
Oh, wow. Okay. What brings you to Brussels?
Family reasons.
Okay.
Family is based here, yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And as we've spoken over the phone, you have a new 4-month-old daughter, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Maybe our listeners may hear at some point weird noises from my daughter, but it should be fine.
Fair enough. Okay. Yeah. Well, so I guess there's probably been a lot going on recently, but how's the term and semester been for you?
Oh, semester has been quiet, especially because I've been on maternity leave until October. I won't be teaching until January this year, so it has been quite relaxed in some ways. I'm busy in other ways. I'm working on research proposals at the moment mainly, and so not a lot about admin meetings and teaching. So it's different from previous year, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Well, any research proposals you'd care to share? Which ones are you working on?
Oh, there's an individual grant that I've been working on, and I'm waiting to hear the results about. And this is going to be a big research project if it is granted on public health from epistemological perspective mainly, but also with implications for policy. And another one is a network grant that I'm working on with a number of colleagues, interdisciplinary in the health sciences, social science and humanities. That's a bit complicated to explain in a few minutes, but yeah, so these are the two main ones I have on my plate at the moment.
Wow. Okay. All right. Well, perhaps we can come back to those and yes. to discuss. Okay. Well, why don't we go ahead and start back at the beginning, Federica, and we can learn about how you got into philosophy of science, how you ended up in Amsterdam teaching and studying philosophy of science. Federica, tell us a little bit about your origin story. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Italy, in the northeast of Italy, in the Veneto region, and then I studied as an undergraduate in Padua. And at that time, Padua was a kind of a place where you would find a lot of Aristotelians, Kantians, Hegelians, and just a tiny bit of philosophy of science. There were people doing analytic philosophy, but they were definitely the minority. But I was interested in philosophy of science mainly. I guess because the question that interested me at that time, and still does in many ways, is how do we know stuff? And so science was the obvious place where you start. And so I did as many courses as possible in philosophy of science, including my bachelor thesis, and then it just got started that way, I would say.
Sure. Before you got into the bachelor's thesis, though, the how do you know stuff question is a big one. Were there times growing up that you explored this in other ways, or just more remedially?
It is a big question, and probably that's why I still find it interesting, intriguing, and worth investigating. And the angle, the perspective I took kind of to tackle this question was from the methodology of the sciences. But from this on, of course, you can look into more general questions about what is knowledge. But the starting point was really in specific scientific fields. How do you build the models in a way that allow you to build the knowledge of something? And so it started in a very modular way. And this is how, in the beginning, I looked into the social sciences, and then epidemiology, and the biomedical sciences more generally, etc. You see, so it is a kind of a common thread that you can find in my philosophical production. Kind of looking at different scientific fields and asking, how do we get to know this and that? You see.
So, was this question of how do we get to know this and this, was this supported in your studies at Padua? I mean, did you find yourself right away in the support of other philosophers, or were you, as you mentioned, looking into the sciences? And what was your experience like there?
That's interesting, because I hope my bachelor supervisor will not listen to this. but so when I started my bachelor thesis, the specific part that was intriguing me was how we build knowledge from probabilities and statistics. But he was not so keen on me doing a whole thesis, bachelor thesis on this. And so I did kind of a compromise bachelor thesis on philosophy of causality and biology, let's say.
How was that a compromise for him? Could you explain a little bit more?
It was a compromise because my supervisor wanted to learn more about biology, and so he was kind of getting help from students to know a lot about philosophy of biology that at that time was a rather emerging field. Now it is definitely established and a big subfield within philosophy of science, but at the time it was still kind of an emerging one.
And probability and statistics weren't of interest, or weren't quite as well to him, I suppose?
No, I guess he didn't see the interest in delving into probability and statistics from the perspective I wanted to take.
Okay.
Because the what I was interested in was what is the relation between the probability and causality, which of course is another big theme that has been discussed in the literature. And so I wanted to understand how we build statistical generalizations, and how they contribute, or to what extent they contribute to establishing causal knowledge, let's say. And that was pretty general. And then over the years, I managed to narrow this down, or to apply a big question like this into specific fields, like the social sciences, using quantitative methods, or epidemiology itself, that is by and large quantitative. So I got to this, but in another way eventually.
Okay. So it sounds to me, as the story you're painting, is that getting into philosophy of science there was a pretty clear path. Did you have any other interests, either academic or other intellectual pursuits you were considering at the time?
Logic was my other big interest, but I couldn't really see a whole career or a kind of a long-term research project I had with logic. Probably because I was not so much interested in the foundations, but more on the applications. And so I don't know. It was a strange thing. So eventually, it was philosophy of science that won. Although kind of the formal element in philosophy of science is present, so I didn't lose it on the way, I would say.
And yes, so I believe you might be the first individual I've spoken to who studied philosophy of science at Padua in Italy. Could you tell us a little bit about your perception of philosophy of science as it's practiced, as it's taught in Italy?
That's a difficult question, because of course what I learned over the years changing countries and institutions is that traditions are not just national but also very local. So at the time I was a student in Padua, the kind of philosophy of science that was taught was mainly history of philosophy of science, and a lot of it was learning about Vienna circular philosophy and philosophy of physics to some extent. There were other topics on the rise, and so I got to study, say, Van Frassen at that time. But it was, mainly what we would call now the analytic philosophy of science tradition, the Anglo-Saxon tradition in philosophy of science. And in many ways, this may still be the dominant tradition in Italy, or at least this is my perception. Although other people do different philosophy of science, are more historically oriented, or they look at other traditions. But my perception is that they are a minority with respect to the analytic one.
Okay. And so, in being taught a lot about history of philosophy of science, is that it sounds like your bachelor's thesis was more specifically in more of like an analytic philosophy of science project, or something not necessarily not necessarily a historical project. But I guess at the time was Hopos, as it's called. Is that something you had wanted to pursue?
So I think, it's interesting the way you ask this question, because being trained in Italy, I got to do history of everything. This is how we do most of philosophy in Italy. We do history of this, history of that, etc. And so the historical perspective is really kind of built in the way we were trained. But probably for this reason, in the first years after my bachelor, I tried to move away from history and do, on the one hand, much more contemporary stuff on the one hand, and on the other hand, try to develop my own views and express them in my own words, or kind of developing my own arguments. You see, instead of doing exegesis of other authors or reconstructing histories of and other things. So, kind of the Hopos tradition that you mentioned was not really what I was after. Although there is a sense in which I have been trained in that tradition.
I think that's a really good point to make. I think that's really good to identify the assumption in my question of that you would choose, like that it's almost it does seem like a later choice to separate from the history, but almost if you're doing philosophy of science in some way, you're engaging in historically, if you're trained in this way, as you're describing, that maybe you're not doing these reconstructions, but history is a very big part of doing philosophy of science, which is definitely not the case for everyone, for many folks. Okay.
That's definitely true. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
So I guess tell us a little bit about that transition to separating from history. So, it sounds like, had some very early interest in the philosophy, in the sciences, beginning at university. What came next in terms of your decision? Was it a fairly simple decision in terms of, this is what I want to do? I'd like to go into academia. I'd like to study. How did that decision come about?
Yeah, so as an undergraduate towards finishing my study, I did have a firm intention of doing a PhD. And then, as often happens in life, it's kind of opportunities come up or things just happen. Yeah. And at that time, I was an Erasmus student in Belgium. So I was an exchange student from Italy. I went to Belgium. And this is where I got an opportunity to submit a proposal for a PhD, and the proposal got accepted. So I went straight into a PhD after my bachelor, really. And so I didn't have to ask myself hard questions whether to continue in academia or not, because it did happen quite naturally.
Seamlessly, yeah.
And relatively easily. And interestingly, the project for the PhD at the beginning was again on causation, but pretty much tailored to physics examples, because at that time that was what was most common to do. At that time, we studied a lot of Wesley Salmon, to be clear, and then. What happened was that, and this is probably the second interesting episode in my early stages of my career. I was giving a seminar as a master student enrolled in the PhD program on causality, and a demographer came to attend the seminar. Mm-hmm. And after my presentation, he gave me a business card and said, "Come to see me and have a chat." And that was a revealing event for me, because he explained to me what he was doing in his daily practice as a demographer, and I could follow most of it up to a certain point. And then there was a moment where I was totally lost. I had no idea what he was doing, really. And this is where I understood that most of what I was in my bibliography was basically philosophy of science talking about something, but not the real scientific practice. And that was one thing. And the other thing was that it seemed to me that we had more kind of firm intuitions about what causation is in physics or physics-related domains, in folk physics, for instance, and much less about kind of what happens in the social sciences. And so this became the next intriguing question for me. How do we establish knowledge about causes in an unstable domain such as the social realm, you see? Yeah. And so my PhD thesis shifted from very classic topics to less explored topics, notably quantitative causal analysis in social science.
Right. So how did you go about getting at that question of how to establish knowledge of causality in the social sciences?
I went back to school, so I started attending classes in statistics. For instance, I started study textbooks in social science methodology. I started talking to social scientists, at least those who were available in Louvain-la-Neuve, where I did my PhD, and trying to get a grip on what was going on in there. And from there, asking my philosophical questions again. And so this changed quite a bit how I pitched the core of my PhD thesis, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you went back to school. So what was it about? What did connecting with the statisticians? What did sort of getting some additional training in these things? What did you think that provided you and your philosophy of science practice?
I think it gave me, well, of course, first-hand knowledge of what I wanted to talk about, which is always a good thing to get, especially because I didn't have a double training as a bachelor student. But apart from that, it was, on the one hand, getting a sense of how statisticians and scientists in general, or social science scientists in general, perceive philosophical questions. What are the philosophical questions that they feel more or less pressing, more or less relevant? This is one thing. Mm-hmm. And the other one is acquiring a vocabulary in order to talk to them. Mm-hmm. And also acquiring a way of explaining to them what's the philosophical point of why is this a philosophical question or a philosophical problem, you see? Right. Because things that may seem obvious to us, that they have a philosophical component, or these are kind of dilemmas, conundrums, for some reason, may not be obvious to them. And so even explaining to them what the problem was an incredibly useful exercise for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this might be a challenge. Can you think back, if possible, to any particular conversations or at least particular problems with which you could recall explaining to scientists, and kind of how you went about doing that?
Yes, maybe I have a good example, because I'm not sure I've succeeded on this one.
Sure.
After many years. So one long-standing collaboration I have is with the demographer that I mentioned before, but also with a statistician and econometrician. The three of us have been working together for over a decade now. And one thing that econometricians are interested in is representing probabilistically a data-generating process. Mm-hmm. And so the philosophical point I was trying to get across my colleague was what it means that this equation or sets of equations represent something, or is the mechanism in the world itself. Mm. So, and I'm not quite sure I managed to explain the difference to him in a convincing way yet, because the two levels I find still confused when we discuss things together. So whether we are really talking about mechanisms in the social world, or whether we are talking about the way we represent mechanisms that may be totally, eventually unknown still, but that we can still get a grip on them by a probabilistic representation.
Yeah. So
is this making sense?
No, well, I think it's getting clear. Well, it's trying to communicate. So what I hear is it's trying to communicate the kind of problem that you might have and the kind of a way to think about as you're working it. So this demographer was looking at, did they use the vocabulary like a social mechanism of some kind, or did they talk about mechanisms at that time?
I guess, in partly I'm using even more contemporary vocabulary, because the using mechanisms became more popular in more recent years. But yes, so there was this talking about real things in the world and the way we represent them. So kind of our knowledge of them, and whether you should go fully realist about them and assume that your probabilistic representation is a kind of a faithful representation of them, or whether what other views can you hold?
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. Well, certainly, and to philosophers of science like us, we're generally, captivated by these kinds of questions, and want to kind of suss them out. Did you find it necessary to try to communicate ever a kind of consequence of why we should even be considering these questions and thinking about these questions in the realm of science? Like, do you feel like you were doing this kind of work in the service of science, or was it more of using the science to get at these other philosophical problems? Oh,
yeah, that's interesting, because ultimately you are asking what the role of philosophy or philosophy of science is.
It could be both. That's a bit, yeah, I guess. I'm trying to put myself, because I've had some of these questions recently with scientists, and coming as a philosopher of science, I'm sitting down and I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to actually engage with them, just to talk, and it turns out, I think, for example, like I've spoken with folks about who are doing research in decision making, and it might be decision making that is impaired decision making, such as in the case of alcohol use disorders, whereby folks who struggle with either controlling or moderating their alcohol use tend to make different kinds of decisions. But it turns out the scientists are very are interested in what exactly do we mean by a decision. When those decisions do take place, what is responsible for those decisions? What exactly is a risky decision? So I think they really do see, at least in this particular case, there is a grip on trying to understand and unravel this philosophical issue related to decisions. And so this is where they're while doing the science, they're still kind of also doing philosophy, as a result. And so, yeah, I guess I was just kind of curious about what it is. Yeah, in your instance with your engagement with the demographer, kind of like what were you guys up to?
Yeah, so I guess the way I would describe my engagement with these scientists, but also with other scientists I came to collaborate later on, is not merely descriptive. So
right.
I'm not talking to them just to get a faithful picture of what they do. I do aim at some kind of normative aims eventually, but not normative in the sense that, I figured out what they have to do, and then I tell them, you have to do this, because this is the right method, this is that. No, I guess I really started with a descriptive approach, because I want to deeply understand what happens. And then the normative is also collaborative with them. So it is with them that I want to develop a concept or nuances in developing a specific methodology and so on. Because if there is something useful that philosophy can do for science, is really kind of improving the science itself, but then you do it together. It's not that this is my it's kind of, I have a beautiful result and now you guys go and implement it because this is the right way of thinking about causality, evidence, or whatever. So over the years, I've been seeing myself as involved in the scientific process, let's say, and always trying to understand what would be useful for me to do. So what would be useful to develop in philosophical terms, not just trendy or fashionable, but really what it is that this specific subfield in science needs at this very moment. And it seems to me that science does need a lot of philosophy, for the simple reason that the methods they develop have to be accompanied by concepts. And if they don't think enough of the concepts, and this may simply be because of time constraints, then we have to join forces, because we philosophers, it's exactly what we do, thinking about the concepts. But I don't want my concepts to be just abstract, detached from the practice, or irrelevant. So I'm trying to do this work as part of the scientific process, so to speak. I hope this is making some sense.
This is making great sense. Yeah. And my apologies if I'm asking, if I'm asking questions that you already essentially described or explained. But no, this is helpful to me and hopefully helpful to listeners to kind of to suss out exactly what we mean and what it is. I think you've done a great job clarifying so far. Wow. Okay. So there's so I'm looking over some of so your projects and some of your works. There's a number of great things that you've done so far. Would you care to describe, I guess, a little bit of what came out of your graduate work and kind of what were maybe some of your big projects that were particularly impactful in your career or your way of thinking in philosophy?
Impactful on me, or that I made an impact on?
Could be both. If you'd like to, maybe we could start with whatever. We could start with something that you feel was perhaps impactful on the field, and then maybe get to, and if that happens to be something, describe how it might have been impactful on you.
Yeah. So I mean. Many people know my work for what has been called the Russo-Williamson Thesis, and this arguably has made an impact on the field, at least because it sparked very vivid debate in philosophy of science on questions related to causation in medicine, more generally how we establish causal relations, and I guess. The reason why I think this is impactful is not so much because many people started debating this and writing papers to show that we were wrong.
Yeah, I'm seeing this right now. Yeah, this is fun.
Yeah. No, I don't take this to be the sign of the impact, really. I take the sign of the impact, the fact that scientists show the interest in the thesis, and with them we explored ways of making this implemented in, for instance, in guidelines or in discussing evidence of mechanisms in medicine. You see, so it's a kind of to me this is an important part of my research. Not so much because philosophers are talking about it, but because scientists have an interest in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So could you maybe give us the sort of the brief description of the Russo-Williams thesis and kind of what it is kind of does in the science, and then some of the criticisms that you've received. So the thesis can be formulated in a very simple way. The thesis says that to establish causal relations in medicine, but also elsewhere, you need evidence of correlations and evidence of mechanisms, or put it in slightly more philosophical jargon, evidence of difference making and evidence of production, for instance. And this has been formulated as an epistemological thesis and a methodological thesis, not as an ontological thesis. So we are not saying what causality is, but we are saying how you get to establish whether something is causal or not. Right. So in the case of smoking, so a lot of folks have written in the case of whether smoking causes cancer, for example. Is just a basic application of this.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, when you reason on well-known examples such as smoking and lung cancer, of course, we do know a lot already. So this seems rather uncontroversial.
Right. Sure.
And this is where I find that this is interesting, you see, because of course you can reason backwards and say, okay, now we do know that smoking causes cancer, and what is this claim composed of, etc. But I think, interestingly, if you look at more controversial cases, then you will see that this is what you strive to obtain evidence of, and it doesn't mean that you always have it.
Mm-hmm. What's an example of a controversial causal case in medicine?
Oh, well, most of the causal relations that are still under discussion or debated. So whether what's a good example of it? I mean, many causes of cancer are not established for sure. So the cell phone radiations, for instance. There is a debate on that. And of course, we are not entirely sure whether these cause brain cancer. But if you read the instructions of your mobile phone, precautionary, they will say that you should kind of put it quite away from, far away from
just
from
in
your
case.
head.
Sure.
Just in case, exactly. But I mean, even looking at historical examples. So recently, I was looking into the controversy of the relation between asbestos exposure and mesothelioma.
Okay.
And even when you look at the very, very early studies, you could see how they are trying to establish that there is a correlation between exposure to asbestos and cases of mesothelioma. But they were also trying to establish whether there is any biological plausibility. And famously, Bradford Hill, in his 9 viewpoints, talked about biological plausibility. So, of course, the thesis does not claim that unless you have a mechanism that is fully described, you cannot establish causation. The thesis aims to say that this is exactly the evidence that you are trying to gather in order to. And of course, you can establish a causal claim to various degrees depending on the quality of your evidence. And this is what we have been trying to do in our latest project in the EBM Plus network that looked at the evidence of mechanisms, because this is something that hasn't been done. So if you take again the field of medicine, broadly construed, something that scientists, statisticians, epidemiologists did very, very well was being able to establish tools to assess the quality of, for instance, RCTs, randomized controlled trials. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we do know when a trial is better than another because of the data they collected, because the way they analyze the data, because of a number of parameters. But something that we know much, much less is how well is or how good is the evidence of mechanism that that is available. How do you assess it? How do you compare results from different research groups? How do you reconcile in case different groups reach different conclusions about mechanistic links, and so on and so forth? You see?
Yeah. Yeah, those just some big questions. Yeah. So I've noticed, in just looking through a number of papers, there have been quite a few people speaking directly to your thesis, either making some kind of critical point or applying it to a new case or a new way of thinking. Have you found anything of interest in some of these responses to your work? In by having sort of this kind of named thesis out there and have gotten its attention, have you traced like kind of the knowledge building in these responses and your response to the responses? Like, has anything come about from that?
Yeah. Some criticism made kind of sense from a philosophical perspective, because of course in philosophy we tend to be super precise about things. So whether the thesis is establishing necessary conditions, sufficient conditions, what happens in case you don't have evidence of correlation or evidence of mechanisms, etc. But in many ways, this criticism, I don't think, added much to the thesis, whereas other papers made more interesting points. For instance, trying to explore what the thesis may mean in different subfields within medicine itself. Because, of course, large part of, say, a motivation of the thesis is the use of randomized controlled trials, but randomized controlled trials are not used everywhere in medicine. So you may want to ask questions about whether this is widely applicable, or what evidence of correlation may mean in other areas. So I guess the interesting question is not whether the thesis is right or wrong, because I don't think that's the point of it. I guess the interest of debating the thesis is what does this tell us about establishing knowledge in different fields, whether they are comparable, whether they are different, and ultimately why we would need these two components. What kind of information are they really providing, you see? And to a certain extent, my intuition is that we need evidence of correlation or of difference making, because you need to be able to identify relevant factors. But this relevance is not just a statistical relevance. And if you are unable to kind of locate these factors in appropriate mechanism, you may miss crucial information, for instance, about how to intervene. You see? And when I say this, what I have in mind are questions about policy. Because maybe you identify relevant factors, and you also have a pretty good understanding of disease causation, say at the biological level, and yet, for policy reasons, you may not intervene at the biological level, you see? You may instead try to reduce exposure by working more at the social level or the socioeconomic level, you see. So correlations and mechanisms give you very complementary information in many ways. So I'm this is getting very long, but
no, this is really well, this piques my own interest. So I appreciate you going into describing and sussing out what it is, how we should think about this thesis too. I think that's really good to get at, kind of understanding what kind of knowledge that it can bring to us, or can provide. I mean, obviously, so the consideration of mechanistic evidence is challenging, especially when there are I imagine there are particular biological sciences, specifically health sciences, that have a little bit firmer grasp on established mechanisms, or not necessarily established, but maybe more robust findings and support. What of those health science fields that do not, that maybe establishing particular mechanisms or integrating particular mechanistic understandings are not so strong? What can the thesis do for those fields? I'm thinking maybe things like psychiatry.
I haven't looked into psychiatry, but I know, for instance, Liz Marie Andersen in Denmark is looking into the thesis in the context of psychiatry. So you may want to have a chat with her about what she thinks this thesis will bring to that field. But another area that where we have very uncertain knowledge of mechanisms is still within the health sciences, is molecular epidemiology, that I've been studied in some detail in the past years. This is where people are trying to establish biomarkers of exposures, biomarkers of early clinical changes, and then of disease development, etc. And what seems to be very, very interesting there is that at some point, at least this is my understanding of what is going on in this field, is that they are not even trying to describe the full mechanism, but they want to reconstruct the salient points of the mechanism by using biomarkers. You see? And so going back to the thesis, again, the point is not to have the complete full mechanism, because
of course,
maybe if the reality is so complex, you will never get this full picture.
So what do you mean by salient points? Points that can be intervened on? I guess.
Yeah. No, so one example I have in mind while I speak is now that they talk about the hallmarks of cancer,
right?
And they don't even try to describe the full mechanism leading to cancer, but they try to identify some key characteristics that recur. And the question is whether they recur all in the same order, in the same way, etc. And the point is that they may not be characteristics on which we can intervene, but these may be characteristics that give us a sense of where we are in the development of the of cancer. You see, as a process.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you may ask the question: why is still this a way of mechanistic understanding of the phenomenon? And I think it is mechanistic because, from an epistemological point of view, you relate this to the how question. Okay? So you try to embed knowledge of these characteristics, hallmarks, etc., in a slightly bigger picture of how things develop. And so you simultaneously want to give an explanation. And then I guess also answering the question of whether you can intervene or not. Most of the time you can't really intervene on those factors, but that's a different point, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for explaining that a little bit more. Okay, so we mentioned one. This certainly is a work that has really impacted the field. I think that's really impressive to have some of your work be applied and or considered and reflected upon not only in philosophy but in the health sciences too, and by scientists. So I applaud you for that. I suppose this could be the similar work that has had perhaps the most impact on your way of thinking. But is this work or another work that has in doing so and investigating it has contributed to your way of understanding how we gain knowledge, as you put it, as kind of your sort of central question of what you've been looking at all your life?
Yeah. So lately, what has made a lot of impact in my thinking is the philosophy of information.
Yeah.
And the reason is that the way I look at the philosophy of information is mainly as a philosophical method. That also has, of course, important consequences for philosophical concepts such as knowledge itself. But I mean, what I really take from the philosophy of information is the way of looking at philosophical questions, not in absolute terms, but always relative to a specific context. So this gives me a methodology whereby kind of I start with the smaller questions and then build up the bigger ones to begin with. But also to realize that a same philosophical question may receive different answers depending on the level at which you pose the question. Okay, so if you ask what is reality, which is of course a huge question, and you ask this to a physicist or to a philosopher or to a biologist or to a lay person, you may get very different answers. And what becomes interesting, I guess, is not whether one is right and the other is wrong, but whether different answers may coexist. And if they do coexist, why is it so? And if they diverge, why do they diverge, or should they diverge? You see? So if you ask a question about reality, I doubt anyone will deny that I have a computer in front of me and also a glass of water, and my mobile phone is an object and things like that. But then if you want to ask what is the nature of reality at a much more kind of lower level, I don't think, a physicist or even a high energy physicist will give you the same answer, you see. So how do we reconcile ideas that at least at first sight, they are so different, you see? And it is in the same vein that I've been asking the same question about causality with my colleague Phyllis Silari, because causality is notoriously the notion that has received too many different answers from the philosophers, from the biologists, from the physicists, from the logician, from you name it, right? And in our book, we counted no less than 20 different accounts in contemporary philosophy of causality, you see. So how do you reconcile these things? And I guess the only way you can reconcile them is precisely by chopping up the questions and trying to understand what these accounts are doing for you.
Yeah.
And the philosophy of information, to come back to the original point, gives me a method to play with different notions, if you see.
Different notions of causality?
Yeah, in this case, causality, yes, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I guess, since we're in the interest of time, so I notice if we locate, you've been working on things related to big data and the philosophy of information. So what kinds of questions are you really interested in? And given that you've said that there are a number of ways, depending on the kind of question, and there, that you have a different. Is the question the focus is on how do you reconcile these ideas, or is that more of like a point to get at? Okay, we need to be selective and careful about the kinds of questions that we're asking. What are the questions that you're interested in?
Because you name big data, that's quite so. The way big data are becoming interesting to me is not because they are big. It's not because they are data on which there is excellent work done by other people. For instance, Sabina Lonelli, of course, but it is because they are expressions of technology-driven research, and this is where I want to understand what technology is contributing to knowledge production. And so, in a sense, ask questions that philosophers of science have kind of left aside a bit, because we did investigate how we produce knowledge, how would we come up with theories, but what is the role of technologies in machines doing there? What is their role? And I do want to go beyond the naive intuition that with a microscope you see the smaller and with the telescope you see the bigger. There is something else that they do. And there is some scholarship investigating that. There is, for instance, of course, the typical position of Ian Hacking in representing and intervening. But even then, I guess there must be something deeper about the very concept of knowledge that we may want to dig out in this investigation. Knowledge then becomes distributed, embodied, connected, a matter of connections more than representation. Technology becomes a part and parcel of the way we produce knowledge. And the philosophy of information, again, gives me tools here because artificial agents.
Can you say more about those tools? I'm not super, my mind doesn't go exactly to what those tools are. Could you explain a little bit?
I was getting to that.
Oh, sorry.
So one concept that, no, that's fine. One concept that the philosophy of information develops is the notion of inforg, informational organism. Now, we are inforgs, we humans, because we process information, but there are artificial agents that are likewise inforgs, you see. And so the question is how we interact among inforgs. And it doesn't really matter that we draw a line between being human and non-human, but the fact that we interact with technologies in many ways to produce knowledge. So the philosophy of information gives me tools to move away from essentialist questions about what distinguishes humans from machines, and focus on the interesting part, namely what it means that we interact with the machines to produce knowledge, and what are the consequences of that. So, would be in a nutshell.
I'm fascinated by this term, by the way. I did not use
Inforg,
it. Yeah, no, this is great. Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. Great. So, I noticed on your website you mentioned you're doing some work related to big data practices and helping us to rethink the notion of objectivity with a collaborator. That seems like something of fairly recent interest. Great. All right. Well, we're getting a little bit closer to the end of our time. But before I get into my final question, so why don't you just tell us a little bit about, what you're currently thinking about, what you're currently working on, any new developments and in your research trajectory?
So the new developments, this stuff on technology is, I would say, is a new development because I did some work on it, but there is much more that I want to do, and hopefully I should be writing a book about technoscientific practices in which I do investigate more closely the role technology plays and the consequences this has on notions such as causation or knowledge itself or truth. The other project I had, and for which I hope to get some funding in the near future, is to connect the philosophy of science question that I've been working on for over a decade now with questions at the ethico-political level. So we have been talking for a long time now about the Russo-Williamson Thesis and what it means epistemologically and methodologically for the health sciences, etc. But something that I think we should be doing next is how these things connect to ethico-political problems. So what difference does it make, or what are the implicit or explicit ethico-political principles that connect to given notions of mechanisms or given notion of health or given notions of evidence? And I give you an example so that you get a sense of what I have in mind. So if you have a concept of health that involves both biological factors and socioeconomic factors, for instance, then you may become normative about how to intervene in different ways. So obesity, how would you fight obesity? If obesity also has socioeconomic causes, then you may have to intervene on the industry, on the food industry, okay?
Sure.
Or if you only intervene by giving information on food labeling, basically what you're saying is, I give you the information and then you're totally free to act as you want. So these are specific ethico-political principles that you are implementing in your policy, you see? But you may act differently depending on how you conceive of health or of causation, or you may act differently depending on what implicit or explicit ethico-political principles you adopt, whether you are a paternalist or whether you are not, for instance.
Okay.
Is this making some sense, or is it still very nebulous?
Well, it's starting to. Well, I mean, it's just complicated. I'm trying to kind of. Yeah. I mean, the way in which. Yeah. I mean, what I see is just the philosophy having really strong consequences for the way in which we make sense of particular ways in which we understand information and in which we understand these causal links, as well as the way in which we understand certain interventions in relation to them.
Yeah. So it wasn't so nebulous after all, because you got it.
Okay. I mean, I'm sure, I think, but this is really great. I think, no, you've done a really nice job articulating and characterizing this. So I think that's essentially what it is. That's great. Yeah, that's fantastic. Why don't we close with the final question I've been asking guests, which is, what do you see the greatest challenge philosophy of science is today?
To me, at least personally, the greatest challenge is really being in a fruitful dialogue with scientists and policymakers. Mm-hmm. And this translates into doing work together. So not just talking about what they do, but also kind of doing stuff together. It is a challenge because what is at stake is really the relevance of philosophy more generally for science and for policy. Yeah. And in a moment where the humanities more generally are seen as a kind of a cherry of a cake, but not as an integral part of our scientific thinking, etc., this seems to me a high stake.
I think that's very true. In Amsterdam, is this a particular place? So it seems like wherever the folks, my experience has been in, that philosophers of science may be a little bit more socially and politically connected, depending on where they're kind of stationed, where they're connected with, and or the particular science with which they're interested in. For example, big data. There's a lot to do there with policy. Climate science. There's a lot to do there with policy. What is it like? I guess I would say for you in Amsterdam, and I don't know, in connecting with policymakers there.
Oh, it is not easy, and it is never easy, because many of these contacts depend on how things go personally. So you may have a very good personal contact with the person, or you may just meet a person at the wrong moment and it doesn't go ahead. But at the moment in Amsterdam, I'm making good contacts with people working at the University Hospital, the Academic Medic Centrum. And through them, I'm getting connected to policy people who have interests that are quite similar to my own at this very moment. But it is a slow process, and a process that requires a lot of patience and resilience. And you should never give up. So, and then I guess something that is often underestimated is the language barrier, because we all speak English as a kind of lingua franca of science, but of course many of these discussions also happen in the local language and in the local culture. And I do speak Dutch, but of course my Dutch is not as good as my English, so this sometimes does create a bit of difficulties. But just to give you an example, there was a very controversial book published by one of the councils in the Netherlands, criticizing very strongly evidence-based medicine. And this was in turn criticized by eminent EBMers in the Netherlands, etc. And so if you want to get into this debate, it's not just because of your ideas, it also you connect locally to the people who are active in those debates, and you can communicate with them in their own cultural terms and language, etc. That's all to say. It's happening slowly, but getting there.
Great. All right. Well, Federica, thank you so much for coming on and taking the time to chat. I'm glad we got to do a sort of a more philosophy-heavy kind of conversation style. Like that was a lot of fun for me. I hope you enjoyed it too. Is there anything you'd like to mention at the end to kind of leave us with? Anything to plug or discuss? Some a work or another program?
Yeah, maybe. Well, apart from a big thank to you for inviting me, for having this stimulating conversation. Maybe one thing that I would like to say is that much of what I've been doing in philosophy is not just my own work. And even though this debated Russo-Williamson thesis has two names, actually behind it there are many more names. And if you visit the EBM Plus website, you will see some of these names. So this to me is important, not because I'm kind of formally giving credits to these people, but because I don't see philosophy as a solipsistic enterprise. I really see it as a kind of collaborative project. So again, to go back, it's not a question whether I'm right or wrong. The question is, what can we do together to make this work, if it has to work at all. So a big thank to all my colleagues who have been with me over the years, I would say.
Very well said. Well, thank you so much again, once again, for taking the time to chat. Have a very lovely Wednesday evening in Brussels. And hope to speak to you again soon.
Thank you so much, Nick.
Okay. All right. Take care. Goodbye.
Bye.